The marriage broker snatched the paper from Clara's hands before she could even finish reading it. "You're going back on the next coach," he said, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Nobody's going to pick you. Look around, sweetheart. You're the last one standing." He was right. Every other woman had been chosen. Every single one. The men of Redstone Valley had walked up and down that line like they were selecting livestock at a county fair, examining, nodding, dismissing. And one by one, each bride had taken a stranger's arm and walked away into a new life. Clara stood alone on the wooden sidewalk, her suitcase at her feet, the Montana sun beating down on the back of her neck, while an entire town watched and laughed. And then a shadow fell across the ground in front of her. If this story already has you feeling something, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The coach from Billings arrived in Redstone Valley on a Tuesday morning, and the whole town already knew it was coming. Word had spread the week before. Thomas Aldgate, the marriage broker who ran his operation out of a converted supply office on the eastern end of Main Street, had managed to bring 8 women all the way from the east. 8 women willing to leave behind everything they knew for the promise of a fresh start in Montana territory. The men of Redstone Valley had talked about nothing else for days. There were ranchers who hadn't spoken to a woman in 3 years. There were miners who'd come west with nothing but a pickaxe and a half-broken dream. There were widowers raising children alone, doing their best and failing quietly every single night. For most of them, the arrival of those 8 women felt like something close to hope. Clara Whitmore had not come to be anyone's hope. She'd come because she was tired, bone-deep, soul-worn tired in a way that sleep could no longer fix. She was 31 years old, which in 1878 meant she was already considered something past her prime by the kind of people who measured women by prime. She had spent the better part of a decade working the floor of a textile mill in Albany, New York. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, her fingers raw by Wednesday and numb by Friday. The money went to her mother's medicine, her younger brother's schooling, the landlord's patience. There was never anything left for Clara herself. When her mother passed in March and her brother took work in Philadelphia, Clara sat in her small rented room and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then she read the advertisement in the newspaper 3 times, folded it carefully, and started packing. She wasn't romantic about it. She didn't imagine some fairy tale life waiting for her in the mountains. She wanted solid ground, honest work, a place where nobody already knew her story and felt entitled to finish her sentences for her. She didn't know that the moment she stepped off that coach, she was going to become a punchline. Boquette. The 8 women climbed down from the coach in order, blinking in the Montana sunlight, adjusting bonnets and smoothing travel-wrinkled skirts. The crowd of men waiting outside Aldgate's office was larger than Clara expected. 30 at least. Some shuffling nervously, some with their arms crossed like they were trying to appear casual and failing completely. Aldgate stood at the front, clipboard in hand, grinning the practiced grin of a man who had learned that his income depended on other people's loneliness. "Gentlemen," he announced, "as promised, 8 fine women, each vetted personally and vouched for by my own hand." Clara noticed immediately that he said nothing about their names. The introductions began. One by one, Aldgate walked each woman forward, recited her age, her home state, and a brief summary of her domestic skills. The men watched, whispered to each other, approached. Choices were made in that particular way that tries very hard to look like something other than what it is. Clara watched the women around her get selected with a strange feeling she couldn't quite name at first. Not jealousy exactly. More like the slow recognition of something she'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to confirm. By the time 6 women had been paired off, she understood. The men weren't just choosing, they were ranking. And Clara, with her work-roughened hands and her practical traveling dress, and her face that had never been described as delicate by anyone, was not ranking high. Next we have, Aldgate consulted his clipboard, Miss Sarah Kimball, 24 years old, from Connecticut. Excellent cook, I'm told. Sarah Kimball stepped forward. 3 men moved toward her at the same time. Clara was standing right next to Sarah. Nobody looked at Clara. By the time the 7th woman was claimed, a low murmur had started moving through the remaining crowd. Men were glancing at Clara and then glancing away. A few drifted off entirely, apparently deciding they'd try their luck some other time. Someone laughed. It was the kind of laugh that isn't really about anything being funny. Clara kept her back straight. She had learned early in the mill that the moment you let your posture slip was the moment everyone around you started deciding things about you that weren't theirs to decide. But her hands were gripping the handle of her suitcase hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale. Aldgate approached her with the expression of a man delivering news he finds mildly inconvenient. "Miss Whitmore," he said, not bothering to lower his voice, "it appears that the gentlemen present have made their selections for today." "I can see that," Clara said. "Now, I want you to understand this reflects nothing on your character." "Then don't make it sound like it does." He blinked, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted by the problem he was trying to manage. He cleared his throat and tried again. "There's a coach back east leaving Thursday morning. I'll cover the fare, of course. The agency takes responsibility in situations like—" "What situations?" Clara asked. Her voice was quiet. That was the thing that surprised people about Clara. She got quieter when she was angry, not louder. The mill had taught her that too. The women who screamed got fired. The women who went silent and kept working outlasted everyone else. Aldgate fumbled. "Well, situations where the match isn't, where the selection process doesn't, where nobody wants her," a man said from the crowd. "Not particularly mean, just matter of fact the way people say things when they've forgotten that the subject of their observation is standing right there." A few people laughed, more than a few. Clara turned and looked at the man who'd said it. He was maybe 45, sunburned, wearing a hat that had seen better decades. He met her gaze for about 2 seconds and then looked at his boots. She turned back to Aldgate. "I traveled 19 days to get here," she said. "I have the same contract every other woman signed. Nothing in that contract says I can be sent home because the men present today weren't interested." "Miss Whitmore, does it?" Aldgate opened his mouth, closed it, looked at his clipboard like it might save him. "No," he finally admitted. "But practically speaking, Clara said, "I'm going to stand right here until the situation is resolved properly. I didn't come all this way to be shuffled onto a coach like a package nobody ordered." The laughter in the crowd faded into something more uncomfortable. A woman standing near the general store said something to her companion in a low voice. Clara caught the words nerve and pitiful, and wasn't entirely sure which one was meant as a compliment. That was when she heard the horse. Not a group of riders. Just one. A single horse coming down the far end of Main Street at a measured walk, like whoever was riding it had no particular interest in hurrying for anyone. People moved, not because they were frightened exactly, but in the unconscious way crowds shift when something commands space without asking for it. The man who dismounted was not what Clara expected from the rumors she'd already overheard. Fragments of conversation on the coach, whispers about a mountain man who kept to himself up north, who came into town maybe 4 times a year, who people talked about in that particular tone reserved for anyone who has chosen to live differently than the people doing the talking. He was tall, not in a theatrical way, just in the plain, factual way of a man who had grown up doing hard physical work in open spaces. His face was weathered in a way that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with weather. He had dark eyes that moved over a situation the way experienced eyes do, taking in the full picture before settling on any single thing. He looked at the crowd. He looked at the paired-off women with their new companions. He looked at Aldgate. He looked at Clara. His gaze didn't slide past her the way everyone else's had. It stopped. "Elias Carter," Aldgate said, with the careful tone of a man who is relieved to see someone but doesn't want to show it too obviously. "Didn't expect you today. I heard you were bringing women through." The man's voice was lower than Clara expected, unhurried. "Thought I'd come see." "You're a little late," someone called out. "There's only one left." The way the man said it, the implication hanging in that word only like a judgment, made Clara's jaw tighten. Elias Carter turned and looked at the man who'd spoken. Not threateningly, just looked at him for a long moment with an expression that communicated nothing at all, which somehow communicated quite a lot. The man stopped smiling. Elias turned back to Clara. "What's your name?" he asked. She studied him for a moment before answering. She'd learned to take a reading of people before she gave them anything, even something as basic as a name. Clara Whitmore. Where are you from? Albany, New York? He nodded slowly. Long way to come. It is. He glanced at her suitcase, then back at her face. You any good with livestock? She almost laughed. Of all the things she'd expected him to say, that was not among them. I know the basics. I learn fast. She learns fast, someone in the crowd muttered, amused. Elias didn't acknowledge that. His attention was entirely on Clara in a way that wasn't intrusive or aggressive. It was simply, completely focused, like she was the only person on the street worth talking to. I have a ranch up in the northern range, he said. About 40 miles from here. It's rough country. The winters are harder than anything you've probably experienced. He paused. And I've been managing it alone for 6 years. That sounds like a difficult situation, Clara said carefully. It is. He picked up her suitcase before she could stop him. Not roughly, matter-of-factly, the way you pick up something that needs to be carried. I'm not looking for someone to take care of, he added, without looking at her. That's not what I mean. Then what do you mean? He finally looked at her again. There was something in his expression that Clara couldn't name yet. Something that looked a little like recognition, which made no sense because they had never met. I mean, I could use someone who knows how to work, he said, and someone who doesn't mind hard truth. The street had gone quiet enough that a horse 3 blocks away could be heard shifting its weight. Clara didn't answer right away. She looked at this man she didn't know, standing in the middle of a town that had just demonstrated quite clearly what it thought of her, holding her suitcase like it was already decided. I have conditions, she said. Something moved across his face. She couldn't tell if it was surprise or respect. Maybe both. I figured you might, he said. Aldgate inserted himself at that point, sensing that the conversation was progressing without his involvement, which was not how he preferred to operate. Now, Mr. Carter, if you're serious about this, we'll need to go through the proper— We'll handle the paperwork, Elias said. Not dismissively, just firmly. With the certainty of a man who has had enough experience with people who make simple things complicated to know how to shut that process down before it starts. Aldgate subsided. Clara said, I need to say this clearly, in front of witnesses, so there's no misunderstanding later. Elias waited. I will not be hidden away, she said. I will not be treated like a burden or an embarrassment or an obligation. I will work alongside whoever I'm partnered with. Not behind them, not below them. If that's not what you're looking for, you should put down that suitcase right now, and we can both go our separate ways without any hard feelings. The crowd was completely still. Elias considered this for a moment. He set the suitcase down. Clara's stomach dropped, but then he extended his hand. Elias Carter, he said, and those terms sound fair to me. She shook his hand. His grip was firm without being performative about it. He shook her hand like she was someone worth shaking hands with, which sounds like a small thing, but wasn't. A woman near the general store said something Clara still couldn't quite hear. Behind her, she caught the words, good luck, delivered in a tone that meant the opposite. She didn't turn around. She picked up her traveling bag. Elias already had the suitcase. And they walked toward his horse together, 2 strangers who had just made a deal that neither of them fully understood yet. It was during the first hour of the ride north that Clara started to understand what she'd agreed to. Elias's ranch wasn't close. It wasn't a pleasant day trip. The road out of Redstone Valley, and she used the word road generously, it was more of a deeply committed suggestion, climbed steadily through pine forest and open meadow and terrain that became incrementally less forgiving the further they traveled. Elias rode ahead. Clara had been given a second horse, a brown mare named Dust, who had strong opinions about her pace and communicated them clearly. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Clara was used to silence. She didn't feel obligated to fill it. But after about 40 minutes, something made her ask. 6 years alone, she said. That's a long time. He didn't answer immediately. She'd noticed that about him already. He didn't rush to fill spaces in conversation, which was either respectful or suspicious. She hadn't decided which yet. My wife died, he finally said. Fever. 7 years ago. My son was 3. A pause. He didn't make it either. Clara said nothing for a moment. I'm sorry, she said. Not in the reflexive way people say it, already thinking about the next thing. She said it like she meant it, which she did. It was a long time ago, he said. Time doesn't always fix things, she said. Sometimes it just changes the shape of them. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, the first time he'd looked at her since they left town. No, he agreed. It doesn't. They arrived at the ranch just before sundown. Clara's first sight of it was not what she'd imagined, though she'd tried hard not to imagine anything specific. The main house was solid, built from timber, nothing elegant about it, but clearly constructed by someone who understood what winters in that country could do to poor craftsmanship. There were outbuildings, a barn, a fence line that needed work but wasn't desperate yet. What struck her immediately was the quiet. Not peaceful quiet, empty quiet. The kind that settles into a space when life has been stripped out of it, and nothing has filled the gap. She understood, standing there in the last light, what 6 years of solitary grief looked like when it manifested in the physical world. The ranch worked. It functioned. But it had no warmth in it, no small signs of someone living, only surviving. She climbed down from dust without waiting for help. Her legs were stiff and her back ached from the ride. The house needs some things, Elias said, with the careful tone of someone delivering understatement. I can see that, Clara said. I didn't know I'd be... He stopped, seemed to reconsider what he was saying. It's not what you're used to. Mr. Carter, Clara said, looking at the house, what I'm used to is a rented room the size of a pantry, with a window that doesn't close properly, and neighbors who argue until 2 in the morning. This is considerably larger than what I'm used to. He looked at her. For the second time, something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't quite read yet. There's a room, he said, off the kitchen. It's small, but that's fine, she said. She picked up her suitcase. He'd set it down to manage the horses, and walked toward the house without waiting for him to show her where to go. 3 days passed before the trouble started. Clara had spent those 3 days learning the ranch with the same methodical attention she'd once applied to learning the machinery on the mill floor. She memorized the supply organization, or the lack of it. She noted where systems had broken down and why. She asked questions when she needed answers and didn't pretend to know things she didn't know. Elias watched her with a quiet wariness that wasn't unfriendly. He'd clearly been alone long enough that having another person in his space required adjustment, like a door that hasn't been opened in years and needs a moment before it swings properly. On the 4th morning, a rider came up from Redstone Valley. Clara saw him from the kitchen window first and went to the door. Elias came out of the barn. The rider was young, maybe 20, with a self-important manner that suggested he was delivering someone else's authority and enjoying the borrowed weight of it. Mr. Carter, the rider said, not bothering to acknowledge Clara's presence in the doorway. Mr. Nathaniel Crawford sends his regards. He wanted you to know he's prepared to make you a very generous offer for the Northern Range property. Elias leaned against the barn door frame. Who's Nathaniel Crawford? The rider looked slightly thrown by the question. Mr. Crawford is a businessman out of Helena. He has substantial interests in... I know who Nathaniel Crawford is, Clara said. Both men looked at her. She stepped down from the doorway and walked toward the rider with her arms crossed. Her voice was steady, but her mind was already running 3 steps ahead of the conversation. She had read about Nathaniel Crawford in 2 different Albany newspapers. He was the kind of man who appeared in newspapers not because of what he'd built, but because of what he'd taken. There had been a land dispute in eastern Montana the previous year. Small homesteaders, displaced through a combination of forged documents and legal pressure applied by officials who seemed very interested in Crawford's continued goodwill. The writer had no idea she knew any of this. Tell Mr. Crawford, she said carefully, that Mr. Carter appreciates the inquiry and will consider his options. The writer blinked. I was told to speak with Mr. Carter directly. You have, Elias said. He pushed off the barn door frame. She speaks for this property same as I do. You have your answer." The rider looked between them with visible discomfort, then turned his horse and rode back down the mountain. Elias looked at Clara. "You know who Crawford is," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know what kind of man he is," she said, "which is more useful." She turned and walked back to the house. Her hands were completely steady. Inside her chest, something that might have been fear was moving fast, finding its shape. She'd seen this pattern before. Not in Montana. Not on ranches. But the pattern was the same. Powerful men didn't send polite riders with generous offers unless they already believed the answer would eventually be yes, one way or another. She went inside and started making a list of everything she needed to document. The rider was the beginning. She intended to make sure it was also the end. The list Clara made that first night covered both sides of 2 sheets of paper. She sat at the kitchen table after Elias had gone to bed, the lamp turned low, writing in the small, precise handwriting she'd developed during years of keeping her own accounts at the mill, because nobody else was going to keep them for her, and a woman who couldn't track her own numbers was a woman who could be cheated without ever knowing it. She'd learned that at 19 and never forgotten it. She wrote down everything she knew about Nathaniel Crawford, the newspaper accounts, the names of the homesteaders she remembered reading about, the Pratt family, a man named Eugene Delacroix, who had somehow ended up with a French name in eastern Montana and lost his land to Crawford's legal machinery anyway. She wrote down dates, approximate figures, the name of the Helena law firm that had appeared in both disputes. Then she wrote down what she didn't know yet. The gaps were larger than the facts, which told her something important. Crawford had not arrived in Redstone Valley yesterday. He'd been building toward something for a while, and she had only just walked into the middle of it. She sat there until the lamp started guttering and her back ached from the hard chair. Then she folded the papers carefully, tucked them inside the lining of her traveling bag where they'd be dry and out of sight, and went to bed. She didn't sleep well. She rarely did in new places. Her mind had a habit of cataloging exits and entrances and structural weaknesses long after the rest of her wanted to stop. But sometime before dawn, exhaustion won. She was up before Elias. That surprised her because she'd assumed a man running a ranch alone would be an early riser out of pure necessity. But when she came out into the kitchen at 5:30, the stove was cold and the coffee hadn't been started, and through the window she could see no light in the barn yet. She built the fire and started the coffee and found the situation in his kitchen cabinets more dire than she'd initially assessed. The organization, if it could be called that, appeared to be based on a system of putting things wherever they fit at the time of purchase, and then never revisiting that decision. There were 2 tins of the same dried beans on opposite shelves. There was flour in a container that wasn't sealed properly and had been receiving moisture from somewhere. There was a jar of something that she genuinely could not identify and decided not to investigate further. She was reorganizing the second shelf when Elias came in. He stopped in the doorway, looked at the counter where she had laid out every item from the first 2 shelves in organized rows. "I'm not throwing anything away," she said without turning around. "I'm sorting. You have things here that are fine. They're just in the wrong place." A pause. "You found the beans." "I found both sets of beans, yes." Another pause. "I forgot I already had some and bought more. Twice, by my count." She heard him move to the stove, heard the particular sound of a man pouring coffee who is accustomed to doing it in a specific way and is adjusting to someone else having already done it. "It's ready," she said. "I can see that." But he didn't sound annoyed. He sounded something else. Something slightly off balance in the way people sound when they're not accustomed to being taken care of in small ways and don't know what expression to put on. She finished the shelf and turned around. He was standing at the stove with his coffee, watching her with that same careful attention she'd noticed on the street in Redstone Valley. Like he was trying to solve a problem he hadn't fully defined yet. "That rider yesterday," she said. "Has Crawford sent people before?" Elias set his cup down. "Once, about 4 months ago. Different man. Said Crawford was interested in grazing rights. I told him no." "And before that?" He thought about it. "There was a surveyor. Last fall. Came through without permission, said he'd gotten turned around, but he'd been on the north edge of the property for most of a day before my neighbor spotted him." Clara felt something click into place. What's on the north edge? Elias looked at her steadily. Why? Because Crawford doesn't buy grazing rights, she said. He doesn't need them. He has more land than he can use already. When a man like Crawford wants property, it's because of what's under it or through it. Water rights, mineral deposits, a route for something he's planning to build. She kept her voice even. So what's on the north edge of your property that someone would want to survey quietly without permission? The silence that followed was about 4 seconds long. She counted. There's a creek, Elias said finally. Runs year-round, stronger than most in the area. Does it connect to anything? Feeds into the river about 2 miles north of my line. Clara nodded slowly. Water. A reliable water source in Montana Territory wasn't just useful. It was the difference between a viable large-scale operation and one that depended on seasonal conditions. If Crawford was planning something significant in the northern range, consistent water access would be foundational. He doesn't want your land because of what's on it, she said. He wants it because of what runs through it. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. You figured that out faster than I did. She didn't know what to do with that. She was accustomed to people being surprised by what she understood, but the surprise usually came wrapped in something dismissive, as if her figuring something out was a trick rather than a result of paying attention. Elias said it plainly, like a fact. I've had practice reading men like Crawford, she said, or men adjacent to him, different industries, same pattern. The mill? She'd mentioned the mill briefly during the ride up. She was a little surprised he'd retained it. The mill. And before that, my father worked for a shipping company. The owner had a talent for identifying what other people needed and finding legal adjacent ways to take it. She paused. Crawford's more ambitious, but the instinct is the same. Elias picked up his coffee again. What do we do? She noticed the we. She wasn't sure he noticed he'd said it. First, we establish exactly what documentation exists for your property rights, she said. Title, survey records, any agreements with neighboring landholders. Whatever you have, I need to see it. There's a box, he said. In the back room. I haven't looked at most of it since Margaret, since I filed it. Margaret, his wife's name, she understood, said, and then almost immediately redirected. She didn't press it. I'll go through the box today, she said, and I need you to tell me the names of anyone in Redstone Valley who you trust, not like, not get along with. Trust. Elias considered this with the seriousness it deserved. James Alderman, former sheriff, runs the hardware now. He's straight. Anyone else? He thought longer this time. Ruth Calver. She owns the boarding house. She's been here longer than almost anyone, and she doesn't have patience for men like Crawford. Good, Clara said. That's enough to start. She turned back to the cabinet. Clara. She stopped. Why are you doing this? He asked. Not suspiciously, genuinely. She thought about how to answer that honestly. Because I didn't come all this way to watch someone take something from you that you built, she said. And because if Crawford succeeds here, we both lose everything, so it's practical. It was practical. It was also not the whole answer, but it was the part she was willing to say out loud on the 5th day of knowing him. The box in the back room was a revelation. Not because it contained what she needed, though it did, mostly, but because of what it told her about the man who had filed it. Every document was present, the original land grant, survey records from 1869, when Elias had filed his claim, a handwritten record of improvements made to the property with dates. A deed showing the property had been transferred cleanly from the Territorial Land Office with no encumbrances. The paperwork was meticulous, not organized the way Clara would have organized it, but complete. Everything there, nothing missing, preserved with more care than the kitchen shelves had suggested he was capable of. She sat on the floor of the back room for most of the morning, going through it. Margaret had kept these records, she realized after a while. The handwriting on the improvement notes changed around 1871, became slightly less careful, more functional. That was the year after she would have died, Clara calculated. Elias had continued the records in his own hand, doggedly, without knowing exactly why it still mattered. She set that thought aside. It wasn't useful right now. What was useful was this. The property boundary was cleaner than Crawford likely knew. The creek Elias had mentioned fell well within the documented claim. There was no ambiguity, no gap Crawford could exploit, at least not in the existing paperwork. Which meant if Crawford wanted to create a dispute, he'd have to manufacture one, which meant forged documents or corrupted officials, possibly both. She was thinking about that, sitting cross-legged on the floor with papers around her when Elias appeared in the doorway. He looked at her and then at the organized spread of documents and didn't say anything for a moment. "Everything's here," she said. "Your claim is solid." Margaret was thorough. He went very still. She looked up at him. His face had done something complicated and was in the process of correcting itself back to neutral. "I'm sorry," she said. "I shouldn't have—" "No." He shook his head once. "It's fine." She was. He paused. "She was the organized one. I was better at building things. You kept the records after she was gone." "Somebody had to." He said it like it was nothing, like it was just the next task on a list, keeping your dead wife's careful records for 7 years in a house that had gone quiet. Clara looked back down at the papers. "We should make copies of the key documents and store them somewhere other than here. If Crawford's men come back and things escalate, you don't want the originals accessible." "James Alderman," Elias said. "He'd keep them." "Good. Can we go to Redstone Valley this week?" "Thursday. I need 2 days to get the fencing on the east line sorted first." "Thursday works," she said. She started carefully restacking the documents. Hudson. 2 days later, the second rider came. This one was different from the first. Older, dressed better. He had the specific posture of a man who works directly for someone important and knows it and uses it as currency in every interaction. He introduced himself as Mr. Holt. He represented Crawford personally, he said. He was here to convey Mr. Crawford's sincerity regarding his offer. Elias met him at the fence line. Clara came down from the house and stood beside Elias, which clearly hadn't been in Holt's expectation of how this conversation would go. Holt looked at her the way people look at something that is in their way and hasn't understood yet that it should move. "Mr. Carter," Holt said, "Mr. Crawford is prepared to offer you a figure significantly above market value for the Northern Range property. He understands that you've built something here, and he wants to compensate you fairly for that." "What figure?" Clara asked. Holt's gaze moved to her slowly. "I beg your pardon?" "What figure is Mr. Crawford offering? You said significantly above market value. What number?" A pause. "That's a matter to be discussed directly with Mr. Carter." "Mr. Carter has asked me to handle the business side of things," Clara said. It wasn't entirely true, but Elias didn't contradict it, which she noted with a private kind of satisfaction. "So the number, please." Holt looked at Elias. Elias looked back at him with an expression that conveyed approximately nothing. Holt named a figure. It was substantial. Clara ran the numbers quickly and kept her face still. It was substantial enough that she understood immediately it wasn't a real offer. It was a test of desperation. A man who genuinely wanted to buy land didn't open that high unless he was in a hurry and trying to make the number too large to refuse. "That's interesting," she said. "Why does Mr. Crawford want this particular property so urgently that he's opening negotiations above market?" Holt's expression shifted in a way he controlled quickly, but not quite quickly enough. "Mr. Crawford has interests in developing the Northern Range generally. Your property is centrally located." "For what?" Another shift. "I'm not at liberty to discuss Mr. Crawford's development plans in detail." "Then tell him we're not at liberty to discuss a sale," Clara said. "When he's prepared to be transparent about his intentions, we're happy to have a real conversation." Holt looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his professional politeness. It wasn't anger exactly. It was the particular expression of a man recalibrating, deciding whether he was looking at someone naive or someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She held his gaze without moving. "I'll convey your position," he said finally. The warmth had gone out of his voice. The polished courtesy was still there, but it was a shell now. He rode back down the mountain without another word. Elias waited until he was out of sight. "You called his bluff," he said. "I called his employer's bluff," she said. "Holt's just the messenger." She watched the dust settle from the horse's departure. "He'll report back that there's an obstacle. Crawford will take a few days to decide how he wants to handle that. And then? And then we'll find out what kind of man he actually is, she said. The offer was the polite version. Whatever comes next will tell us a lot more. She turned and walked back toward the house. Her shoulders were straight. Her hands, down at her sides, were not entirely steady, but she kept them close enough to her skirt that nobody would have been able to tell. Thursday came and they rode to Redstone Valley. James Alderman was exactly what Elias had suggested, a compact, weathered man in his 60s who ran the hardware store with the quiet efficiency of someone who had spent years as sheriff and hadn't entirely stopped thinking like one. He had a handshake like a door closing and eyes that took inventory of you without seeming to. Clara liked him immediately, which she took as a reasonable sign. She laid out the situation in his back room while Elias leaned against the shelving and let her talk. She explained what she knew about Crawford, what had been communicated through the two riders, and what she suspected Crawford's actual interest was in the property. Alderman listened without interrupting, which was rarer than it should have been. When she finished, he said, "The Pratt family, you mentioned them. From the Eastern dispute, yes. You know them?" Franklin Pratt's brother settled near Redstone 5 years back. He's told the story. Alderman's jaw tightened briefly. Crawford's operation put Franklin off his land using a title dispute. Said there was an error in the original survey. By the time Franklin got a lawyer who'd take him on, the case had been run through 2 corrupt judges, and he was done. "Was there a specific law firm involved?" Clara asked. "Hargrove and Mills," Alderman said, with the tone of someone pronouncing the name of something unpleasant. "Helena-based? They've been Crawford's legal arm for at least 3 years. Clara wrote the name down. She'd brought a fresh notebook from the supplies she'd purchased that morning. "Do you know anyone at the Territorial Land Office who isn't connected to Crawford?" Alderman thought about that carefully. "There's a man named Theodore Birch. He came in from the east about 2 years ago, federal appointment. He's not local, which means Crawford hasn't had enough time to get to him yet." He paused. "I can't promise that, but it's my best read." "That's all I need," Clara said. "A best read and a name." She looked up from the notebook and found both men looking at her. Alderman with something that looked like cautious approval. Elias with that expression she was slowly learning to read, which was a kind of concentrated attention that he didn't spread around carelessly. "You've done this before," Alderman said. It wasn't quite a question. "Not exactly this," Clara said, "but close enough." She closed the notebook. "We need to store copies of Elias's property documents with you, if you're willing. Originals stay on the property, copies here. And I need to know if you hear anything from Redstone about Crawford's next move." "I hear most things," Alderman said simply. "Then we have a deal." She extended her hand and Alderman shook it without a second's hesitation, which was the most significant thing that had happened in Redstone Valley since she'd arrived, though nobody on the street outside would have known it. They stopped at Ruth Culver's boarding house on the way back through town. Ruth was a broad, direct woman of maybe 55 who had run the boarding house for 22 years and had the kind of authority that came not from position, but from the fact that she had simply outlasted every situation that had tried to diminish her. She served them coffee without asking if they wanted it, which Clara appreciated. When Clara explained the situation, Ruth's response was immediate. "Crawford's been buying up goodwill in this town for 2 years," she said. "Quiet money. Donations to the church fund, loans to businesses that were struggling, the kind of generosity that makes people feel obligated." Her voice was flat. "I don't take his money. I made that decision early." "Why?" Clara asked. Ruth looked at her steadily. "Because I've seen that kind of generosity before. It's an investment. Sooner or later someone comes to collect. Have others in town started to see it that way?" "Some. Not enough." Ruth refilled the coffee without being asked. "But people talk to me. I hear what they won't say to each other. And I'll tell you this. There are 3 families in this valley who've had property trouble in the last year. Small things. Survey disputes, a well that supposedly crossed a property line. Nothing that's gone legal yet, but enough to make people uneasy." She set the coffee pot down firmly. "Crawford's been circling this area for a while. Elias's land is just the piece he wants most." Clara looked at Elias across the table. He was looking back at her with an expression she recognized now. It was the look of a man who has been operating alone for so long that having someone beside him working the same problem felt unfamiliar enough to require adjustment. The three families, Clara said to Ruth. Do you think they'd talk to me? Ruth studied her for a moment. Maybe, if they thought it would help. It might, Clara said. If Crawford is using the same approach across multiple properties, the pattern becomes evidence. One isolated complaint is easy to dismiss. A documented pattern across several families is harder to ignore. Ruth nodded slowly. I'll reach out. No promises. No promises necessary, Clara said. Just the conversation. The ride back up to the ranch was quieter than the ride down, not uncomfortably quiet. The kind of quiet that settles between people who have spent a full day working alongside each other and don't need to perform anything anymore. The sun was dropping behind the western peaks by the time they came through the pine line, and the ranch came into view below. The light hit the main house at an angle that made it look, just for a moment, less like a place where someone had stopped living and more like a place where something might start again. Clara wasn't given to sentiment. She noticed the thought and filed it away without doing anything with it. They put the horses up together without dividing the task. She handled Dust, he handled his own animal. They split the feed and the water without a conversation about who would do what. It was the kind of wordless coordination that takes a long time to develop between people and almost never happens in 5 days. She noticed that too. When they came out of the barn, Elias stopped, not dramatically, just paused in the way of someone who's decided to say something and is making sure it's the right thing before it's irreversible. I want you to know, he said, that what you did today, with Alderman, with Ruth, I wouldn't have done that. You would have figured it out eventually, she said. Maybe, but I'd have been slower and less effective. He wasn't being self-deprecating. He was being accurate, which was different. You see how things connect. She looked at him. The last of the light was doing something to his face that made him look less guarded than usual, or maybe he just was less guarded than usual. I spent a lot of years watching men with power move around men without it, she said. You learn the patterns. That's not a small thing to have learned. No, she agreed. It isn't. They stood there for a moment in the cooling air. Not close exactly, but not far either. The distance of two people who have stopped needing to maintain a formal margin. Then she shivered, because the mountain evenings in Montana did not consult your emotional state before arriving. Go in, he said. I'll get the last of the water. She went in. She started the stove. She heard him outside, the familiar specific sounds of someone finishing the last chore of the day, and she stood in the kitchen of a house that still felt like someone else's house and waited for the water, and thought about patterns and about what Crawford would do next. The answer came 8 days later, and it was worse than she expected. A man from the county assessor's office arrived with a document claiming that Elias Carter's original land survey contained a boundary error, a technical deficiency that, if upheld, would place the creek and the northern 12 acres of the property in an unregistered gray area, open to competing claims. The document was signed by a deputy assessor named Garfield Morton. Clara read it 3 times before she looked up. Elias was watching her face. Is it real? He asked. The paper is real, she said carefully. Whether what it says is true is a different question entirely. She set it on the table and smoothed it flat with both hands, the way she used to flatten the fabric samples at the mill that came in creased and needed to be read accurately. Garfield Morton, she said. Do you know him? By name only. He's been at the county office about 18 months. 18 months? Clara did the calculation without showing it on her face. Hargrove and Mills had been Crawford's legal arm for at least 3 years, according to Alderman. Crawford had been buying goodwill in Redstone Valley for 2 years. A deputy assessor appointed 18 months ago who was now filing a boundary challenge against Crawford's primary target. The timeline was not a coincidence. This is how he does it, she said quietly, almost to herself. Clara. She looked up. Tell me, Elias said. Not desperately, just directly. The way a man asks who has decided he wants the honest version and not the softened one. She told him. She told him that Crawford had done this before, that the boundary challenge was almost certainly based on forged or manipulated survey data, that Morton was likely either paid or pressured, that the legal process, once initiated, would be designed to be expensive and slow and confusing enough that most people gave up or ran out of money before the truth emerged. She told him that they were not going to do that. Elias listened to all of it. His jaw was tight by the end, but his eyes were steady. "What do we need?" he said. "The original survey instruments," she said. "The actual measurements from 1869. If we can show that the numbers in Morton's document don't match the physical reality of the property line, that's the beginning of proving the document was manufactured." "I know where the survey stakes are," Elias said. "I've never moved them." "Good." She stood. "We go tomorrow morning. We document everything, and then we find out who Theodore Birch is and whether he's worth the ride to Helena." She picked up the document from the table. It was Crawford's first real move. Not a rider with an offer. Not a polite conversation about market value. He had decided that since she wouldn't be bought, she would have to be buried under paperwork instead. She set the document back down with a steadiness she was manufacturing through pure will and went to find her notebook. She had more to write. The survey stakes were exactly where Elias said they'd be. That was the first thing that mattered. Clara had half prepared herself for the possibility that Crawford's men had already moved them. It would have been the logical next step, eliminating the physical evidence before anyone thought to check it. But they were there, iron stakes driven deep into the ground at each documented corner of the property, weathered but solid. The kind of work done by a man who intended his boundary markers to outlast argument. They spent the better part of the morning on the north edge of the property. Elias walked the line from stake to stake, while Clara measured and wrote. She wasn't a surveyor. She knew enough mathematics to be dangerous, and enough about how measurements work to understand what she was looking for, which was the one thing that mattered: whether the numbers in Morton's challenge document matched the physical reality of the ground they were standing on. They didn't, not even close. The document claimed a boundary discrepancy of approximately 40 yards, enough to pull the creek and the surrounding acreage into disputed territory. But when Clara paced the distance from the northeast corner stake to the creek bank and compared it against the original survey records Elias carried in his coat pocket, the creek was where it had always been, well inside the documented line. 40 yards, she said, looking at the numbers she'd written. Someone made up 40 yards. Elias crouched near the stake and looked at the notched mark on its face. The mark matched the notation in the original survey exactly. How do they expect this to hold up? They don't, necessarily, she said. Or not forever. They just need it to hold up long enough. She stood and looked north toward the creek, its sound carrying faintly through the trees. A legal dispute takes time. Time means lawyers, which means money. And while the case is being contested, Crawford's position is that the land's ownership is unclear, which gives him grounds to file his own competing claim. Even if he eventually loses, he's tied up the property for years. And in the meantime, the water isn't available to you for development, which means whatever he's planning that needs the water can proceed unopposed everywhere else while you're stuck in court. She folded the notebook closed. He's not trying to win a lawsuit. He's trying to bury you under one. Elias was quiet for a moment, looking at the stake. My father drove this stake, he said, not asking for anything, just saying it. The way you say things when they matter in a way that's hard to articulate. I know, Clara said. She didn't say anything else. She'd noticed that about grief, how it surfaced in specific physical things, driven stakes, a box of careful records in a back room. A notebook that kept going after the person who started it was gone. She turned back toward the ranch. Let's go build the case. The case, as it turned out, needed more than measurements. Clara had understood this already, but understanding something in theory and working through it in practice were different experiences. Back at the kitchen table, with the measurement notes spread beside the original survey records and Morton's challenge document, she traced through what she had and what was still missing. The measurements proved Crawford's document was wrong. But wrong wasn't the same as fraudulent. A court, particularly a court in a county where Crawford had been quietly investing in goodwill for 2 years, could look at the same discrepancy and decide it was an honest clerical error, a survey misread, a number transposed. These things happened. She needed to show it wasn't a mistake. She needed to show it was deliberate, which meant she needed Garfield Morton. Not physically, not yet, but she needed to know who he was, where he'd come from, and whether there was a connection between him and Crawford or Hargrove and Mills that predated his appointment to the county assessor's office. She wrote that at the top of a clean page and underlined it. "You look like you're trying to see through the paper," Elias said. He'd come into the kitchen quietly. She'd noticed he moved without making much noise, a habit of years in open country, where sounds meant things. He set a cup of coffee next to her without asking if she wanted one. "I need to know about Morton," she said. "I told you what I know." He sat down across from her. "Which isn't much. Where did he come from? Before he was in the county office?" Elias shook his head slowly. "I'd have to ask Alderman. Can you send a letter? Tomorrow's mail goes out on the South Road. I can have it there by morning." She was already writing. "Tell Alderman I need Morton's background, where he worked before, who recommended him for the position, whether anyone local knows him personally or whether he arrived as a stranger." She paused. "And ask if he can check the Helena paper archives for any mention of the name Garfield Morton in connection with land transactions or legal proceedings." Elias looked at the letter taking shape. "You write fast." "I think fast," she said. "My hands are just trying to keep up." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before it disappeared. What? While they waited for Alderman's response, Clara turned her attention to the three families Ruth Calver had mentioned, the ones who'd had smaller property troubles in the past year. Ruth sent word that two of them were willing to talk. The third wasn't ready yet, which Clara understood. Fear made people careful about who they trusted, and trust in a place like Redstone Valley was built in years, not days. The Hendersons came first. Robert Henderson was a cattle rancher about 10 miles southeast of Elias's property, a quiet man in his late 40s who had the particular stillness of someone who'd been worrying for a long time and had gotten practiced at not showing it. His wife, Agnes, was less practiced. She showed it clearly. They sat in Ruth's boarding house parlor because neutral ground was important. Clara had suggested it, and Ruth had arranged it without anyone needing to explain why. "It started with a fence line dispute," Robert said. "Our neighbor to the north, Caldwell. He claimed our eastern fence was 8 feet onto his property. We've had that fence in the same place for 11 years. "Who represented Caldwell in the dispute?" Clara asked. Robert and Agnes looked at each other. "A firm out of Helena," Agnes said. "Hargrove and—" "Mills," Clara said. Agnes blinked. "Yes. How did you know?" "Because they've done this before," Clara said, "and they'll do it again if nobody stops them. What happened with the fence?" "We paid to have it resurveyed," Robert said. His voice was flat in the way of someone describing money that still hurts. "Cost us most of what we'd saved since spring. The survey confirmed we were right. Fence was exactly where it always was." "Did Caldwell drop the dispute?" "He did, but—" Robert stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. "3 weeks later, someone offered to buy our property. Stranger. Said he was representing a development interest out of Helena. Wouldn't say who." "Did he name a figure?" "Above what it's worth," Agnes said. "Considerably above," Clara wrote in her notebook. She didn't look up. "Did you ask him who he was representing?" "He wouldn't say. Said the buyer wanted to remain anonymous until an agreement was reached." Agnes's voice had gone tight. "I told Robert it felt wrong. Why wouldn't someone say who they were if they were making a legitimate offer?" "Because they're not," Clara said simply. "They're testing whether you're distressed enough from the fence dispute to sell at a discount before you recover your footing." She looked up. "Did the stranger come back?" "Not yet." "He will," she said. She kept her voice steady on purpose. "But I want you to know, what happened to you with the fence is the same method that was used against at least 2 other families I can document. The dispute wasn't about the fence. It was about draining your resources and your confidence before someone came to buy." She set the pen down. "That's a pattern, and a pattern can be used in court." The Hendersons looked at her in silence. "You think this Crawford is behind it," Robert said. "I think I can prove it," Clara said. "But I need your survey records, both the original and the new one you paid for. I need the dates of the dispute and the offer, and I need you to be willing to make a statement if it comes to that." Agnes reached across and put her hand on Robert's arm. Something passed between them. The particular communication of long marriage, two people who had gotten good at saying complicated things without words. What do we get out of it? Robert asked. Not greedily, just practically. If this works, you get Crawford and Hargrove and Mills removed from this valley before they do to your property what they're trying to do to Elias's, Clara said. That's all I can promise. I won't pretend otherwise. Robert nodded slowly. Fair enough. Alderman's letter came 4 days after Elias sent his. Clara was in the barn when Elias brought it out. She'd been helping him work through a fence repair that couldn't wait any longer, and her hands were scraped and her patience for the work was thinner than she'd have liked. But the fence needed doing, and being able to patch a fence was one of the things she'd said she could learn when she'd set it standing on a street in Redstone Valley, so she was learning it. She wiped her hands on her apron and took the letter. Alderman had been thorough. She read it standing there in the barn doorway with Elias looking at her face instead of the letter. Garfield Morton had previously worked for a land management office in Billings. Before that, he'd been employed by a private firm called Montana Land Services, operating out of Helena. Montana Land Services had handled the due diligence for 3 separate land acquisitions in the eastern part of the territory over the previous 4 years. The acquiring party in all 3 cases was an investment consortium operating under a shell company name that Clara didn't recognize. But Alderman had done one more thing. He'd checked the incorporation records at the territorial courthouse. The shell company had been registered by the law firm of Hargrove and Mills. Clara read that last part twice. Morton worked for Crawford before he was appointed to the county office, she said. Elias had gone completely still. That's how the boundary document exists, she continued. It's not a bribed official, or not only a bribed official, it's an installed one. Crawford put his own man in the assessor's office and waited until he needed him. She lowered the letter. This is bigger than your land, she said. How much bigger? Crawford's been building this for years. She handed the letter back to him, turned, and walked to the fence post they'd been working on. She picked up the hammer and drove the nail she'd been about to drive before the letter arrived, because the fence still needed doing and her hands needed something to do while her mind worked. Morton's file on your property is just one piece. He's likely filed or prepared to file against others, possibly under different pretexts so the pattern isn't immediately obvious. The Hendersons, Elias said. The Hendersons had a different firm for their neighbor's dispute, but the timing lines up with Crawford's overall approach in this area. She drove another nail. I need to see if Morton's name appears on any of the official documents in the Henderson situation. Agnes said Hargrove and Mills represented their neighbor. If Morton also signed off on the original survey that Caldwell disputed, we have a direct connection. And if we have a direct connection, then we have conspiracy instead of coincidence, she said. Conspiracy is something Theodore Birch at the land office can't ignore. She straightened up and looked at the fence line. It was holding. Not perfect, but solid. We need to go to Helena, she said. She hadn't expected Elias to push back. He didn't, which she was learning was characteristic of him. He thought things through, and once the thinking was done, he moved. There wasn't a lot of space between his decisions and his actions, which she found easier to work with than men who needed to be convinced of things they'd already decided were true. What she hadn't expected was the conversation the night before they left. She was at the table working late, as had become her habit, when she heard him stop in the doorway behind her. She'd come to recognize the particular sound of it. His boots on the kitchen floor had a specific rhythm, and the pausing of it had a different quality than him just stopping to think. You should sleep, he said. I need to finish mapping the connections before we go. I want the whole picture drawn out before we sit across from Birch. She kept writing. If I go in with notes and he asks me a question I have to dig for, it looks unorganized. It's past midnight. I'm aware. He came into the kitchen instead of going back to bed. She heard him fill his water cup and then unexpectedly pull out the other chair and sit down. She looked up. He was looking at the diagram she'd made. Boxes connected by lines, names, and dates linked to events. The web of Crawford's operation laid out on 3 sheets of paper that she'd pinned edge to edge. You made this tonight? He asked. Most of it. The base came from my notes. She looked at it alongside him. The shape of it was clearer than it had been 2 weeks ago, which meant it was working. Does it make sense to you? I sometimes organize things in a way that only makes sense to me. He studied it for a moment. Morton in the middle, he said. He's the hinge. Everything Crawford did required a sympathetic official inside the county process. Morton is how legitimate-looking documents get filed for things that aren't legitimate. Elias's finger moved along one of the connecting lines without touching the paper, just tracing the logic. Hargrove and Mills are on the outside, but they're sourcing the pressure. Legal cover and muscle, she agreed. Legitimate firm with a corrupt practice. The two work together. Hargrove and Mills generate the paperwork, Morton validates it from the inside, and Crawford's money is far enough removed that he can claim ignorance if one piece falls. But if Morton falls, he goes to Hargrove and Mills to preserve himself, she said, and if Hargrove and Mills are exposed, Crawford loses his insulation. Elias leaned back. He has to admit what the land was for. Which is what we need Birch to understand, Clara said. This isn't one man taking one ranch. This is an organized effort to manipulate territorial land records for private profit. That's a federal matter, not just a county dispute. Elias was quiet for a moment. You're going to take Crawford down, he said. Not admiringly, not skeptically, just observationally, the way he said most things. I'm going to try, she said. There's a difference. Not always, he said. She looked at him across the table. He was tired. She could see it in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his eyes that were deeper than they'd been 2 weeks ago. Running a ranch alone while simultaneously preparing a case against a powerful man's corruption was not a restful combination. Neither of them was getting enough sleep. I need to tell you something, he said. She waited. When I came to Redstone Valley that day, I hadn't planned on it. He looked at the table, then back at her. I'd been coming down for supplies. Heard what Aldgate was doing, thought I'd take a look. He paused. I wasn't looking for anyone. I want you to know that. She wasn't entirely sure why he felt he needed to say it, but she listened. When I saw you standing there, he said, alone and the way you were, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't that you looked like you needed saving, it was the opposite. What was it? You looked like you were making a decision, he said. Right there in the middle of all of it, not panicking, just deciding. He looked at the diagram again. I thought that's someone who figures things out, and I needed someone who figures things out. I just didn't know how much yet. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the mill, about 12-hour days and frozen lungs in January, and every decision she'd made alone because there was no one to make them with. About arriving in a strange town and standing on a sidewalk while people laughed, and deciding, yes, he had it right, she had been deciding that she was not going to define herself by what this moment was offering her. I needed somewhere to land, she said. Not romantically, honestly. I'd been working so hard for so long, taking care of everyone else's problems, and I needed solid ground and honest work. She looked at the papers between them. This isn't what I expected solid ground to look like. No, he said. It rarely does. The lamp between them was burning low. Neither of them moved to fix it. We should both sleep, she said finally. We should, he agreed. He didn't move immediately. Then he stood, picked up his water cup, and looked at the diagram one more time. You're going to want to show Birch the timeline first, before the documents. Give him the shape before you give him the detail. She blinked. Yes, that's right. You'd have figured that out in the morning, he said. Go to sleep, Clara. He went back to his room. She sat there for another minute in the dimming light. Then she put a note at the top of her Helena presentation. Timeline first, shape before detail. She folded the diagram carefully and put it in the notebook and went to bed. She slept better than she had in weeks. They rode out for Helena 3 days later than Clara had wanted because a problem with the barn roof couldn't be deferred, and Elias had spent a day and a half fixing it in a driving rain that left him soaked through and bad-tempered in the specific way of men who don't complain out loud but make their feelings known through excessive competence applied aggressively to physical tasks. She didn't point this out. She cooked, kept the notes organized, and let him work. Which Clara was fairly certain was exactly that, a pretext. How long? Ruth asked. 4 or 5 days, depending on how Birch receives us, Claire said. Ruth handed up a parcel through the stirrup. Food for the road, don't argue. Clara didn't argue. The third family, Ruth said, quieter. The Morrisons. They came to me yesterday. She looked up at Clara with an expression that was equal parts satisfaction and worry. They want to talk. Tell them to wait until we're back, Clara said, and tell them not to accept any offers or sign anything in the meantime. Ruth nodded. Her eyes moved to Elias briefly, then back to Clara. She didn't say anything, but her expression held a particular quality, assessment, and something that looked a lot like approval. Clara clicked dust forward before the moment could become anything more than it was. They rode out of Redstone Valley without looking back. The road to Helena was 2 days hard riding. The mountains around them were enormous and mostly indifferent, which was the thing about Montana that Clara had been slowly coming to understand. The landscape didn't care about human problems. It just was. There was something almost restful about that once you stopped expecting it to be otherwise. On the first night, they camped at the edge of a creek crossing. While Elias built the fire with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, Clara went through the Helena presentation one more time by the last of the daylight, checking the sequence, making sure every document was tabbed and every connection was labeled. She was annotating a margin note when a sound from across the creek made her look up. Elias was already on his feet, hand near his rifle, looking into the tree line on the opposite bank. Clara went still without needing to be told, a quality she'd developed on a mill floor where machinery noise meant you had to be able to read the situation from partial information. A deer emerged from the tree line, regarded them briefly, and moved on. Elias sat back down. His hand moved away from the rifle. On edge, Clara said. Not as a criticism. Going to Helena to confront a corrupt county official and everything connected to him, he said. Yeah, I'm on edge. It's a reasonable response, she said. He looked at her across the fire. Are you on edge? She considered the honest answer. I'm focused, she said. On edge would slow me down. Focused keeps me moving. Is there a difference? For me, yes. She turned back to the notebook. When I'm scared, I work. Always has been. Were you scared the day you arrived in Redstone Valley? She kept her eyes on the page. Terrified, she said, but I wasn't about to let Thomas Aldgate see it. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, he made a sound that might have been a laugh, brief and low, more surprise than amusement. What? She asked. I thought you were the calmest person I'd ever seen, he said. Standing there while everyone was watching, I thought you just didn't feel it. I felt every bit of it, she said. I just didn't let it decide anything. She looked up at him across the fire. The light did things to his face again, made him look like someone who was slowly becoming less afraid of being seen. That's something, he said quietly. It's the only thing I've ever been sure of, she said, that I can feel the fear and keep moving anyway. The fire crackled between them. Above, the Montana sky was doing its thing. A quantity of stars that cities had no equivalent for, spread out in a darkness so clear it looked almost manufactured. She went back to the notebook. He poured water for the coffee. Neither of them said anything else for a long time, and it was the most comfortable silence Clara could remember in years. Tomorrow, they would reach Helena. The day after that, she would sit across from Theodore Birch and lay out everything she had built over the past 3 weeks. The measurements, the connections, the timeline of a man's careful corruption. She went through it one more time in her head. She was ready. What she didn't know, and couldn't have known sitting by that fire with the creek running quiet beside them, was that Crawford already knew they were coming. That Holt had received word from inside Redstone Valley. That by the time Clara and Elias arrived in Helena, a man named Edwin Price, Hargrove's senior partner, would already be in Theodore Birch's office, and that what he said in that meeting would force Clara to make a decision she hadn't prepared for and couldn't take back. They reached Helena late on the second afternoon, road-worn and stiff, the horses needing water badly and Clara needing about 10 minutes alone to think without the sound of hooves on packed earth filling up all the available quiet in her head. Helena was louder than Redstone Valley, in the way that places with money are always louder. More wagons, more voices, more of the specific kind of noise that comes from transactions happening in every direction at once. The territorial capital had been a mining town before it was anything else, and it still had that quality of a place where people had arrived looking for something and hadn't quite decided whether they'd found it. They found rooms at a modest boarding house off the main street. Separate rooms which Clara had navigated without discussion by requesting them that way at the desk, and the owner hadn't blinked, which she appreciated. She washed the road off her face and hands, changed into the one presentable dress she'd packed. Dark blue wool, plain but well cut. The kind of dress that said, "I am serious," without trying to announce it, and sat down with her notebook. She was going over the timeline sequencing for the third time when Elias knocked. "Birch's office is 2 streets over," he said when she opened the door. I walked past it. "Did you go in?" "No, figured we'd go together in the morning." He paused, looking at her. "You should eat something." "I'll eat after Clara." His voice was patient but firm, in the way of a man who has spent enough time around her now to know when she is running on momentum and ignoring everything her body is telling her. "The notes will be the same after supper as they are now." She looked at him for a moment, then at the notebook. He was right, which was mildly annoying. "Fine," she said, "but I want to be at Birch's office when it opens tomorrow." "We will be." They ate at a small restaurant 2 blocks from the boarding house. Nothing remarkable. Beef stew that was slightly oversalted and bread that was slightly underbaked, the kind of meal that exists entirely to be functional. Clara ate all of it, which confirmed that Elias had been right about the eating. She was thinking about Birch, how to open, what to lead with, whether to present the timeline as a document or walk him through it verbally first, when Elias said her name. She looked up. "Stop planning for 20 minutes, he said. "Just stop." "I'm not—" "You're doing it with your eyes," he said. "You get a specific look." She almost asked what specific look, then decided she didn't need to. "If Birch has already been approached by Crawford's people, then we'll deal with that when we see it," Elias said. "Worrying about it tonight doesn't change it." She looked at him across the table. "Do you not worry?" "I worry plenty," he said. "I just do it while I'm doing something else. Worrying on its own never fixed a fence." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a very practical philosophy." "It's the only one I found that worked." She picked up the bread and ate the rest of it. Outside the restaurant window, Helena moved through its evening, lamps coming on, voices dropping to the particular register of people who have finished the day's business and are transitioning into something less purposeful. She thought about what he'd said on the trail, that he'd come to Redstone Valley that day without a plan, and seen her making a decision in the middle of a street full of people laughing at her, and thought, that's someone who figures things out. She had spent so long being the person who figured things out alone. The weight of that was something she'd stopped noticing because it was so constant. You stop noticing the things you carry when you've been carrying them long enough. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For the 20 minutes, she said. He nodded once, not making anything of it, just accepting it. They walked back to the boarding house in the dark. The door to Theodore Birch's office was open when they arrived the next morning at 8 o'clock. Not open because Birch was ready for them, open because someone was already inside. Clara heard the voice before she saw the man, a measured, deliberate tone, the kind developed by people who have learned that speaking slowly makes everything you say sound more authoritative. She stopped in the doorway. The man seated across from Birch's desk was perhaps 60, silver-haired, dressed in the particular way of Helena money, well-tailored but not flashy, the clothes of someone who has been wealthy long enough to stop needing to prove it. He had a leather document case on his knee. Birch himself was younger than Clara had expected, early 40s, with the slightly compressed look of a man operating under more pressure than his face had fully learned to conceal. He saw Clara and Elias in the doorway, and something moved across his expression that was too quick to read. The silver-haired man turned. "Miss Whitmore," he said, as if he knew her, as if he'd been expecting her. "And Mr. Carter, what a coincidence." It was not a coincidence. His use of their names confirmed that without any ambiguity. "Edwin Price," Clara said. She kept her voice level. Inside, something cold and fast was moving through her chest, reorganizing everything she'd prepared. Price smiled with his mouth. "You know me." "By reputation." She stepped into the office. She hadn't decided to. Her feet made the decision, and she followed. "Hargrove and Mills, you've been Crawford's legal representation in at least 3 land disputes in the territory over the past 4 years. Birch stood. Perhaps we should schedule a formal time." "Mr. Birch," Clara said, still looking at Price. "I apologize for arriving without an appointment, but I'd like to stay, if you don't mind. Given that your current visitor represents the opposing party in the matter I came here to discuss, it seems like information Mr. Birch should have before this conversation concludes." Price's smile didn't change. "There is no opposing party, Miss Whitmore. We're all interested in the same outcome, a fair resolution of a property question." "We have different definitions of fair," Clara said. "That's what makes us opposing parties." She walked to the chair beside Price, set her notebook on Birch's desk, and sat down. Elias remained standing near the door, which she understood without looking at him. He was positioning. If anyone came in or tried to leave, they'd do it past him. Birch looked between them with the expression of a man who had expected a manageable morning and was revising that assessment rapidly. "Perhaps," he said carefully, "you could tell me what you've brought." "Gladly," Clara said. She started with the timeline. Shape before detail, the way Elias had said by the fire. She walked Birch through it without reaching for a single document, just talking, moving through the sequence of events with the particular clarity of someone who has organized something in their head often enough that it flows without effort. She told him about the 2 writers, the above-market offer that disclosed no purpose, the surveyor who had trespassed on the north edge of Elias's property the previous fall, Morton's boundary challenge and the specific 40-yard discrepancy that the physical survey stakes disproved, the connection between Morton and Montana Land Services, the connection between Montana Land Services and Hargrove and Mills, the Henderson family and the fence dispute that preceded an unsolicited purchase offer from an anonymous buyer, the timing, across all of it, that was too consistent to be coincidence. When she stopped, the office was very quiet. Price had not interrupted her once. That was more alarming than if he had. "Those are serious allegations," Birch said. "They're documented allegations," Clara said. She opened the notebook and began laying papers on his desk in the order she'd tabbed them. Original survey records for the Carter property, including stake measurements taken 18 days ago that contradict the boundary assessment filed by Deputy Assessor Morton. Records of Morton's prior employment at Montana Land Services, which was incorporated by Hargrove and Mills. Timeline of the Henderson property dispute and the subsequent purchase approach from an undisclosed buyer, with dates. She set down the final page. And a written statement from Robert and Agnes Henderson attesting to their experience. Birch looked at the papers. He didn't touch them. He looked at Price. Price was very still. "Mr. Birch," Price said, in that measured tone, "what you're looking at is a collection of circumstantial materials assembled by a woman who arrived in this territory 6 weeks ago and has, for whatever reason, decided to involve herself in a legal matter that—" "The legal matter involves her home," Elias said from the door. His voice was quiet. "That makes it her business." Price glanced at him, then back to Birch. "The boundary assessment filed by Deputy Assessor Morton is a legitimate product of the county process. If Mr. Carter has concerns about its accuracy, there are established procedures. The established procedures take 18 months and cost more money than most of the families Crawford is targeting have," Clara said, "which is exactly why they were designed that way." She looked at Birch directly. "Mr. Birch, I'm not here to ask you to rule on a boundary dispute. I'm here because what I've documented is an organized effort to manipulate territorial land records using an official who was placed in his position specifically to facilitate that manipulation. That is a federal matter. And if it isn't addressed at this level, the families in Redstone Valley have no recourse." Birch looked at the papers on his desk for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll need time to review these materials." "Of course," Clara said. She kept the relief out of her voice. He hadn't dismissed it. He hadn't handed it back. He was going to look. I'll need the originals of the survey records. I brought copies, Clara said. Originals are stored with a reliable party in Redstone Valley. I can arrange for them to be provided through official channels once we know what this review requires. Price stood. He did it slowly, with deliberate control, the movement of a man who is choosing to leave rather than being removed. Mr. Birch, I trust you'll apply the appropriate professional standard to whatever materials have been presented here today. He picked up his document case. Mr. Crawford is a significant figure in this territory, and this kind of... Mr. Price, Birch said. Price stopped. Birch looked at him with an expression Clara couldn't fully read from the side, but she caught enough of it. The compression around his eyes, the particular jaw set of a man who is deciding something he's been approaching for a while. I'll be in touch with your office, Birch said, through formal channels. Price held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and left. The door clicked shut behind him. The sound was very clean in the quiet room. Clara exhaled slowly through her nose where nobody could see it. They spent 2 hours with Birch. He was careful, more careful than she'd hoped, but also more engaged than she'd feared. He asked good questions. He asked them without leading, which was the sign of someone who genuinely wanted to understand rather than someone who was looking for a reason to agree with what he'd already decided. He went through the timeline she'd laid out and asked her to clarify 3 points, all of which were legitimate areas of ambiguity that she had answers for. When they finished, he stood and extended his hand, first to Clara, then to Elias. I won't make you any promises, he said. I want to be honest about that. Honest is what I'm asking for, Clara said. I'm going to request Morton's full employment file from the county, Birch said, and I'm going to pull the incorporation records for Montana Land Services independently. If what you've shown me checks out, he stopped. It may take some time. Crawford's influence in this territory is it's not nothing. I know, Clara said. I'm not asking you to be fast. I'm asking you to look. He nodded. I'll look. They left the office and stepped out into Helena's morning, which was going about its business completely indifferent to what had just happened inside that room. Elias stood beside her on the sidewalk. He didn't say anything right away. Well, she finally said. He'll look, Elias said. That's what I think, too. But? She shook her head. Crawford knows we're here. Price will be back in his office in an hour. Whatever Birch does from here, Crawford will know about it. She started walking. We need to get home. They left Helena the following morning before first light, pushing the horses harder than Clara was entirely comfortable with, because something at the back of her mind was insisting on urgency in a way she couldn't dismiss. She'd been right to listen to that feeling before. She listened to it now. They were still half a day out from Redstone Valley when they came around a long curve in the road and found James Alderman waiting. He was sitting on a fence post at the edge of his property line, which was 2 miles east of town. He'd been waiting long enough that his horse was cropping grass 20 feet away, completely unbothered. Clara pulled dust up. You came out to meet us, she said. Not a question. Figured you'd be coming through about now. Alderman looked at them both. His face told her something was wrong before his words did. Crawford's men came through 3 days ago, 4 of them, asking questions about you, Clara, specifically. Her jaw tightened. What kind of questions? Whether you were here freely, whether Elias had brought you against your will, whether there was anyone who'd say you were being held, was the word they used. Alderman's voice was flat with a particular kind of anger. They were laying groundwork, trying to build a story that made you less credible. She'd expected an attack on her reputation eventually. She hadn't expected it to move this fast. Did anyone talk to them? Elias asked. A few people, Alderman said, not flinching from it. Not everyone in Redstone Valley is going to stand up to Crawford's men when they come asking pointed questions. You understand that? I do, Clara said, but Alderman reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. Ruth Kelver had a thought. She thought it before I could, which I'll admit to. He handed the paper to Clara. She drafted something, said you'd know what to do with it. Clara unfolded it. It was a letter. Ruth's handwriting, clear and direct, an account of Crawford's men in Redstone Valley, their questions, their insinuations, and Ruth's own direct observations of Clara Whitmore as a woman who had arrived of her own free will and conducted herself with complete agency throughout her time in the valley. It was signed by Ruth, and below Ruth's signature were two other names, Agnes Henderson and a woman Clara didn't recognize. Martha Morrison, Alderman said, nodding at the third name, from the family that wasn't ready to talk. She's ready now. Clara looked at the letter for a long moment. Crawford had tried to make her invisible, to build a narrative where she was a passive figure without agency, someone whose observations couldn't be trusted because she was herself a victim of the man she was accusing. Ruth had seen it coming and moved first. I need to write something, Clara said. Alderman nodded like he'd expected this. Ruth's parlor is available. They reached Redstone Valley in the late afternoon and went directly to the boarding house. Ruth met them at the door with the specific expression of a woman who has been managing a situation in your absence and is ready to give a full accounting. She had done more than the letter. In the 3 days since Crawford's men had come through asking questions, Ruth had quietly spoken to every woman in Redstone Valley she trusted. Not a large number, but a precise one. She had told them what was happening. Not dramatically, just plainly, the way you tell people things that they need to know. 4 of them agreed to put their names on something if it came to that, Ruth said. 2 more said they'd testify, but not in writing yet, and Thomas Aldgate. Aldgate? Elias said. He came to me this morning. Ruth's mouth did something complicated. He said Crawford's man approached him last week and offered him money to say that you'd been coerced into going with Elias, that the whole match had been improperly conducted. She looked at Clara. Aldgate told him no. Clara blinked. Of everything she'd expected, Thomas Aldgate developing a conscience had not been on the list. He told me he felt bad about how things went the day you arrived, Ruth said. He said, she paused, seeming to decide how much of it to convey. He said he'd seen a lot of women come through and he'd never seen one hold herself the way you did, and he wasn't going to let somebody use his name to take that apart. The kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at her hands on the table. They were not steady, and she didn't try to make them steady. Sometimes things earned the physical response they earned. Tell him thank you, she said. Ruth nodded. Now, the letter. Clara had written it in Alderman's hardware store, standing at his counter while Elias held the inkwell steady because the counter had a slight lean. She'd written it in one draft, which was unusual for her. She typically revised everything twice. But this one had come out clean because she'd been thinking about it since Alderman told her what Crawford's men had done, and by the time pen met paper, she knew exactly what it needed to say. It was a letter to the editor of the Redstone Valley Courier. In it, Clara stated her name, her origins, the circumstances of her arrival in the valley, and the free and deliberate nature of every decision she had made since. She described, in plain language, the attempts that had been made to characterize her as a woman without agency, and why those attempts had been made. She named Crawford's operation not as a personal vendetta, but as a documented pattern with specific victims. She listed, briefly and with dates, the families who had been targeted. She signed it, Clara Whitmore Carter. She had not consulted Elias before writing that name. She wasn't sure what made her write it. Some decision that had been building for 3 weeks finally reaching its natural conclusion on a piece of paper in a leaning hardware store. When she'd finished, she'd handed it to him to read without looking at his face. He'd read it, set it down, said, "The name is right." That was all. Ruth read the letter now, at her kitchen table, without speaking. When she finished, she put it down with the same care you'd put down something that mattered. I know the editor, she said. He'll run it. Will Crawford try to stop it? He can try, Ruth said. By the time he knows it's coming, it'll already be in print. The letter ran 4 days later. Clara didn't see the reaction directly. She and Elias were on the ranch, where the work of living had not paused for any of this, and she had 3 weeks of neglected organization to catch up on. But Alderman wrote up on the afternoon the paper came out with a report that was more comprehensive than she'd expected. People were talking, not all of them in Clara's favor. Crawford had enough presence in Redstone Valley that some people were cautious, or loyal out of obligation, or simply didn't want the trouble. But the conversation had shifted. Something that had been happening quietly was now happening in public, which changed the rules. Two men who had previously been reluctant approached aldermen with information about their own experiences with Crawford's representatives. One of them had been approached to sell water rights he hadn't known he had. The other had been told, by someone from Hargrove and Mills, that a clerical error in his original land filing might create problems, and that selling to a private party now would resolve the issue before it became official. The second one had a name for the man who'd approached him: Edwin Price. Clara received this information sitting at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, reading Alderman's report by lamplight, and she set the paper down and looked at the lamp for a long time. Price hadn't been in Birch's office to protect Crawford's legal interests in a general sense. He'd been doing what Clara had been doing, getting ahead of the problem. He'd known the meeting with Birch was coming and had tried to preemptively poison the water. The same way he'd approached that rancher with the clerical error story, the same way Crawford had sent men to Redstone Valley to undermine Clara's credibility. They were all versions of the same move. Get there first. Define the story before the other person can. The difference was that Clara had spent 3 weeks building a network that Crawford didn't know existed. Alderman, Ruth, the Hendersons, the Morrisons, Aldgate's conscience. 7 or 8 voices, none of them powerful on their own, but together creating something that was much harder to dismiss than one woman on a mountain. She was still thinking about this when she heard Elias come in from the barn. He came into the kitchen, took off his coat, and looked at her face. "What happened?" he said. She told him about Price and the rancher. She told him what she was thinking, about the network, about how the letter had changed the conversation in ways she hadn't fully anticipated, about what their next step needed to be. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he sat down and laced his hands on the table and looked at them for a moment. "You know what this means," he said. "That we've pushed far enough that Crawford is going to respond," she said. "Not with writers, not with legal documents." "He's going to come at us directly," Elias said. "Yes." Neither of them said anything else for a minute. "Then we make sure," Elias said slowly, "that when he does, there's nowhere for him to hide afterward." He looked at her. "What do we need?" Clara opened the notebook. "I need to write to Birch," she said. "The price information changes his calculus, and I need aldermen to get statements from both men Crawford approached before anyone pressures them to stay quiet." She paused. "And I need everything we have stored in 3 different places, not just aldermen's, somewhere Crawford can't reach in one move." She wrote while she talked. Her handwriting was getting faster. She'd noticed this over the past weeks, the way urgency had worked its way into the mechanics of her hand. "There's a judge in Helena," Elias said. "Retired federal circuit. His name is Marcus Webb. He moved to a ranch out past the Helena line 8 years ago. He's got no connection to Crawford." She looked up. "How do you know him?" "He bought a bull from me 3 years back," Elias said. "Came up to look at the stock himself. We talked most of an afternoon." He paused. "He's not someone Crawford's bought. He's been out of the system long enough to be clean." "If Birch moves on what we've given him," Clara said, "Webb could be the person we need to receive the full case, independently. So even if Crawford applies pressure to Birch, Webb has everything." "Yes." Elias nodded. "I'll write to him tonight." They worked at the table together for 2 hours. She wrote to Birch. He wrote to Webb. She reorganized the document copies into 3 separate envelopes. One for aldermen, one she would post to Ruth, one she would keep. She updated the timeline with the new price information. By the time they finished, the lamp was low again. Elias pushed back from the table and stretched his back, which had been bothering him since the barn roof repair in the rain, a fact he would not mention, and she had deduced from the particular way he moved when he'd been sitting too long. "You should put something on that," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "Your back. You've been favoring the left side for 2 weeks. A pause. "I'm fine." "I didn't say you weren't. I said you should put something on it." She got up and went to the supply shelf, found the liniment she'd reorganized into a logical location 6 weeks ago. "Sit still." He looked like he was going to argue, then apparently decided it wasn't worth the energy. She worked the liniment into the muscle along his left shoulder blade while he sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the wall. He didn't make a sound, but she could feel the tension leaving the muscle incrementally under her hands, The specific give of something that has been held too tight for too long finally being allowed to release. Better? She said. Yeah, he said, quietly. She put the liniment back on the shelf. Clara. She turned. He was still looking at the wall. When this is over, he said. When it's settled. Whatever settled looks like. He stopped, started again. I want you to know that whatever you decide about staying or Elias. He stopped. I'm not going anywhere, she said, simply, not dramatically, just the fact of it. He turned and looked at her. Okay, he said. It was an insufficient word for what it covered, and they both understood that. She went back to the table and picked up the envelopes. Get some sleep, she said. We mail these in the morning and then we wait. The waiting, as it turned out, lasted 11 days. And on the 12th day, 7 armed men rode up the mountain. Clara saw them first. She was up on the slope behind the barn checking the water line that fed the upper trough. A job she'd taken over 3 weeks ago when she noticed Elias kept putting it off. Not from laziness, but because it required crawling through a section of brush that tore at your sleeves and his were already repaired twice. She didn't mind the brush. She minded inefficiency. She saw the riders come around the lower tree line and stop, 7 of them, spread in a loose line the way men spread when they want to look like more than they are. She came back down the slope at a controlled pace. Not running. Running communicated panic, and panic was information she had no interest in giving anyone, but she moved. Elias was coming out of the barn when she reached the yard. 7 men, she said, coming up the south trail. They stopped at the tree line. He looked at her face. Whatever he saw there made him go to the barn doorway and reach for the rifle without asking another question. Don't bring it out yet, she said. He stopped. If they come in peace, the rifle escalates things unnecessarily, she said. And if they don't, I want to talk first. Clara, I want to talk first, she said again. Please. He set the rifle against the inside of the barn door frame. Within reach, not in hand. His jaw was tight, and his eyes were doing the particular focused thing they did when he was running calculations he didn't like the results of. The 7 men rode into the yard. The one in front was not Holt. Not someone Clara recognized. He was maybe 50, thick through the shoulders, with the particular expression of a man who has been given a job and has done enough similar jobs to not feel much about it either way. Professional in the worst sense of the word. Mr. Carter, he said. He didn't acknowledge Clara at all, which told her exactly what kind of man he was and what kind of instructions he'd been given. Mr. Crawford has authorized me to inform you that the boundary assessment filed by the county has been upheld at the regional level. As of this week, the northern 12 acres of this property, including the water access, are under a contested claim. Mr. Crawford is prepared to resolve the dispute immediately and fairly if you're willing to discuss terms. What terms? Clara said. The man looked at her the way you look at something that is spoken when it wasn't expected to. Ma'am, my instructions were to speak with Mr. Carter, and I'm telling you to speak with both of us, Elias said from the barn doorway. His voice was calm, completely calm in a way that was not reassuring to anyone who understood what that kind of calm meant. Or you can get back on your horse and tell Crawford we declined. The man recalibrated, slightly. Mr. Crawford's terms are simple, he said. Sign over the deed to the Northern Range property, accept the compensation already offered, and this matter is resolved without further difficulty. Without further difficulty, Clara repeated. She let that phrase sit in the air for a second. Is that a description of the current situation, or a warning about what comes next if we refuse? The man said nothing, which was an answer. Clara looked at him steadily. Her heart was hitting her ribs hard enough that she could feel it in her throat, but her voice came out even. I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because I'm going to say it once, and I need you to carry it back to Crawford exactly as I say it. The man waited. Every document we have establishing the legitimacy of this property claim has been copied and placed in 4 separate locations in this territory, she said. 2 of those locations are in the care of individuals who have already been in contact with Theodore Birch at the Federal Land Office in Helena. One set is with a retired federal circuit judge named Marcus Webb, who has been reviewing the material for 8 days and has already sent an inquiry to the Territorial Attorney General's office. She paused to let that land. The fourth set is with the editor of the Redstone Valley Courier, who has been given instructions to publish everything in the event that anything happens to this property or to either of us. The man's expression had changed. Not dramatically, but it had changed. Additionally, she continued, we have written statements from 6 individuals in Redstone Valley describing Crawford's pattern of land manipulation in this area. We have documentation connecting Deputy Assessor Garfield Morton to Crawford's operation predating his appointment to the county office. And we have a witness who can testify that Edwin Price personally approached them with a coercive offer designed to create a false legal vulnerability in their property claim. She took one step forward. Crawford's boundary assessment has not been upheld at the regional level, she said quietly. That's a lie he sent you here to tell. What has actually happened is that Birch has opened a formal review of Morton's conduct, and Price spent 3 days last week answering questions he didn't want to answer. She looked at the man directly. So when you go back and you tell Crawford what I just told you, and you will tell him because it's your job, make sure he understands this. Signing anything under duress while a federal review is active would constitute an additional crime. We are not signing anything. We are not leaving. And if these 7 men take one step toward this house, the full story is in print by Friday morning. The silence that followed was the longest Clara had experienced since she'd stood on a sidewalk in Redstone Valley while people laughed. This one felt different. One of the 7 men shifted his horse. Another looked at the man in front, then looked away. Small movements. The kind that happened when the situation a group of men thought they were riding into turns out to be a different situation entirely. The man in front looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Elias. Then he looked back at her. I'll convey your position, he said. It was the same thing Holt had said weeks ago when the whole thing was still politely transactional. But it sounded completely different now. Then it had been a professional courtesy. Now it was a retreat dressed up in professional language. The 7 men turned their horses and rode back down the mountain. Clara watched them until they were into the tree line and the sound of the horses faded into the general silence of the mountain. Then her legs felt strange and she put her hand on the fence post beside her and kept it there for a moment. Elias was beside her before she'd decided to move. Not touching her, just beside her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him in the way you feel the warmth from something solid. You all right? He said. Give me a minute, she said. He gave her the minute without comment, which was exactly right. The minute stretched to 5. The mountain was quiet around them in the way it always was, the indifferent, enormous quiet that she'd come to find more grounding than unsettling over the weeks. Was it true? He said eventually. Everything you told him. Most of it, she said. Birch did open a formal review. Webb did get the materials. The Courier editor does have instructions. She straightened up and took her hand off the fence post. The part about the regional assessment being a lie. I don't know for certain, but Crawford wouldn't send 7 men up here if the legal situation were actually resolved in his favor. He'd wait for the court to do it for him. The fact that he sent men means the legal path isn't working. You called his bluff. I called what I understood his situation to be, she said. There's a difference. If I'd been wrong, we'd be in a very different conversation right now. He looked at her. But you weren't wrong. Not this time, she said. I've been wrong before. I'll be wrong again. Today wasn't the day for it. She picked up the work gloves she'd set on the fence post when she came down from the slope. She put them on. Her hands were steadier than they'd been 60 seconds ago. Let's finish the water line, she said. Theodore Birch's formal letter arrived 12 days later. It came with a second letter from Marcus Webb and a third, unexpectedly, from the Territorial Attorney General's office, which was a name on a document that neither Clara nor Elias had ever expected to see in connection with their property. Clara sat at the kitchen table and read all 3 letters in order, without expression, while Elias stood at the stove and waited with the particular patience of a man who has learned that rushing Clara Whitmore when she is reading something important is not a useful expenditure of energy. When she finished, she set them down and looked at the table. Birch found enough to refer the case, she said. Morton's been suspended pending investigation. The county assessor's office has been instructed to withdraw the boundary challenge. Elias was very still. Webb's letter confirms the Attorney General's office has opened a formal inquiry into Crawford's land acquisition practices in the territory. 4 properties named. Ours is one. The Hendersons' situation is another. She paused. Hargrove and Mills have been asked to appear before the Territorial Bar Committee. She picked up the 3rd letter. The Attorney General's office wants statements from us, she said, and from the Henderson family and from the Morrisons. They want to schedule a formal proceeding in Helena within 30 days. She set the letter down. For a moment, neither of them said anything. It worked, Elias said. He didn't say it triumphantly. He said it the way you say something when you've been holding yourself carefully against the possibility of failure for so long that the arrival of a different outcome requires a moment to settle. It started working, Clara said. There's still a proceeding. Crawford will have lawyers. He always has lawyers. Better ones than Price now, probably, she said. Price is busy with the bar committee. She allowed herself one small thing. She pressed the letters flat on the table with both hands and looked at them. Weeks of work. And they had become these 3 pieces of paper on a kitchen table in a ranch house in the Montana mountains. But the foundation is solid. What we built is solid. He can't manufacture his way around physical survey stakes and 6 witnesses and a federal review. Elias crossed the kitchen and stood at the edge of the table. He picked up the Birch letter and read it again, though she knew he'd already read it once over her shoulder. He set it back down. He put his hand over hers on the table, briefly, just for a moment, the way you do when words are insufficient and you know it. Then he said, I'll write to the Hendersons. I'll write to Alderman and Ruth, she said. They sat down together and started writing. Mount. The proceeding in Helena lasted 3 days. Clara had expected it to be difficult. It was more difficult than she'd expected, which was its own kind of lesson. You can prepare for hard and still find that the actual thing has edges you didn't account for. Crawford's new lawyers were skilled and aggressive in the particular way of people who are skilled and aggressive on behalf of someone they know is guilty, which required a certain kind of flexible relationship with the truth that Clara found professionally impressive and personally contemptible. They questioned the accuracy of her survey measurements. They questioned her competence to interpret legal documents. They suggested, with careful indirection, that her involvement in the Carter property was itself irregular given the unusual circumstances of her arrival in the territory. She answered every question directly, without defensiveness, with the specific documentation required. She had practiced this, not the answers, those she knew, but the tone. Defensive tones lose cases. She had seen it on the mill floor when women who were entirely in the right lost arguments with foremen because they sounded like they were apologizing. She was not going to apologize for anything she had done. Elias testified separately. He was brief and factual and completely immovable under questioning, the way a man is when he has nothing to hide and understands exactly what he's being asked. James Alderman testified. Robert Henderson testified. Agnes Henderson, who had been nervous on the coach from Redstone Valley and visibly frightened when she arrived at the proceeding room, looked at the panel of officials and told them what had been done to her family in a voice that started uncertain and ended clear. Martha Morrison testified and cried once and didn't apologize for it and kept going. Thomas Aldgate testified about the attempt to buy his corroboration for a false narrative about Clara. That piece landed harder than Clara had anticipated. Crawford's lawyer objected twice and was overruled both times. On the 3rd day, Crawford himself appeared. He was not what she had constructed in her mind over the weeks of fighting him at a distance. She had built him into something more purely menacing, she realized, a cartoon of powerful corruption. The actual man was in his late 50s, well-dressed, with a face that had probably been handsome once and was now just expensive-looking. He had the manner of someone who had not been told no in so long that the current situation didn't entirely feel real to him yet. He looked at Clara once, when he was taking his seat. She looked back at him without moving. He looked away first. His lawyers argued that everything Crawford had done was within legal boundaries, that the boundary challenge had been a legitimate exercise of the county process, that any connections between Crawford and Morton were professional, not improper, that the purchase offers made to various landowners were standard business practice. Marcus Webb, who had been asked to sit in an advisory capacity given his prior review of the materials, asked one question. He asked Crawford's legal team to explain why Montana Land Services, Crawford's shell company, incorporated by Hargrove and Mills, had employed Garfield Morton for 2 years before Morton's appointment to the county assessor's office, given that Morton's appointment had then been used to file a boundary challenge against a property Crawford had simultaneously been attempting to purchase. The answer that came back was long and complicated and explained nothing. Webb wrote something down. He didn't look up when he wrote it. He didn't need to. The formal decision came 4 weeks later by post. Crawford was found to have engaged in a coordinated pattern of improper land acquisition practices, using a placed official, manufactured legal challenges, and coercive purchase pressure. Morton's appointment was voided, and he was barred from public office in the territory. Hargrove and Mills were referred to the territorial bar for disciplinary proceedings, and eventually, though this came later, Edwin Price lost his license to practice. Crawford was ordered to withdraw all claims against Carter property, to compensate the Henderson family for their survey costs and additional documented losses, and to make financial restitution to 2 other families whose situations had been identified during the inquiry. He was not imprisoned. That part was harder to accept than Clara had expected. She'd understood intellectually that men with money rarely went to prison for what they did with that money, but understanding it and experiencing it were different. He was exposed, financially penalized, and stripped of the legal infrastructure he'd built to protect his operations. In practical terms, his ability to operate the same way in Montana Territory was finished. It wasn't justice in its fullest sense. It was the version of justice available in 1878 in Montana Territory, which was partial and imperfect and still, compared to the alternative, enormously significant. She sat with that for a few days before she made peace with it. She wasn't the kind of person who pretended a partial victory was a complete one, but she was also not the kind of person who let the incomplete prevent the possible. And what was possible was that the families in Redstone Valley kept their land. The creek stayed inside Elias's property line. Morton was gone. Crawford had been forced to show himself in public as what he was. The truth had reached further than his money. That, she decided, was enough to build on. The school was Elias's idea. She hadn't expected that either. She'd been thinking about it. There were children in the valley with no access to formal education, families who'd come west with ambitions that included giving their children more options than they'd had themselves, and the nearest schoolhouse was 40 miles of bad road. She'd been turning the problem over in her mind without having said anything out loud. Then one evening, about 3 weeks after the decision arrived, Elias said, "There's a building on the south edge of the property. The old equipment shed. The roof's solid, the floor's good timber. It's too big for equipment storage." She looked at him. "It's about the right size for a schoolroom," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "We'd need a teacher. You know people in the East. I know people who know people," she said, which was how most things actually worked in her experience. "It would take time to arrange, and money." "The restitution from Crawford covers more than the land costs," he said. "We have a surplus." She looked at him across the table. This man who had driven iron stakes into mountain ground years ago with the intention that they would outlast argument, who had kept careful records in his dead wife's handwriting until he learned to keep them in his own, who had shaken her hand on a Redstone Valley sidewalk because her terms sounded fair. "You want to build a school," she said. "I want to do something with what we have," he said. "That's what you do with what you have. You build something." She thought about the mill floor in Albany, about her mother's medicine and her brother's schooling and the things she'd put aside so long she'd almost forgotten they'd existed. About a woman who could have spent her whole life making other people's fabric and never had anything of her own to show for it. "All right," she said, "let's build a school." The teacher they found was a young woman named Eleanor Voss from Ohio, 24 years old, who had been teaching in a one-room schoolhouse outside Columbus and wanted something bigger and stranger and further from what she knew. Ruth Calver handled the correspondence after Clara provided the contacts, and Eleanor arrived in Redstone Valley in the spring with 2 trunks of books and the kind of energy that comes from someone who has found the exact thing they're supposed to be doing. The first day of school in the converted equipment shed, Clara stood at the back and watched 12 children arrange themselves on the benches Elias had built over the winter. The room smelled like fresh-cut timber and chalk. Eleanor Voss stood at the front with the confident posture of someone completely in their element and began. Clara didn't cry. She thought about it, which was more than she usually allowed herself. Then she went outside to check on the water trough she'd noticed was running slow, because there was always something that needed doing, and that was all right. Elias found her there 20 minutes later. "You didn't stay," he said. "I stayed long enough," she said. "She's good." He stood beside her and looked at the building. The sound of Eleanor's voice, clear and carrying, reached them faintly through the timber walls. Not words, just the rhythm of someone teaching. "My son would have been 10, he said. She went still. She didn't look at him. She understood that he wasn't asking for anything. He was just saying it, letting it exist in the air between them on this specific morning, in front of this specific building, because some things needed to be said in the place where they were finally true. "I know," she said. He nodded once. They stood there together for a few minutes. The mountain was doing its enormous, indifferent thing around them. The children's voices reached them now, answering a question, Eleanor's voice rising in response. "Come on," Clara said. "The east fence still needs that post replaced before the ground freezes again." "I fixed that post," he said. "You propped it. There's a difference." He made a sound that was more laugh than not. She had heard that sound more frequently over the months. This man who had been alone so long that laughter had gone rusty from disuse, slowly remembering what it was for. She picked up her gloves from the fence rail. He fell into step beside her. What Clara understood, later, not that day, but in the accumulated days that followed, the ordinary, difficult, beautiful, ordinary days of a life built on ground she'd chosen, was that none of it had been about being chosen. She had stood on that sidewalk in Redstone Valley, and the town had looked at her and decided she was the last one, the leftover, the woman nobody wanted. And some part of her had known, standing there, that if she let that become her story, she would carry it forever. So she had refused. Not in a dramatic way. She hadn't given a speech. She hadn't wept or pleaded or made anyone feel guilty. She had simply declined to accept someone else's conclusion about her worth, which is a harder thing than it sounds when you are standing alone in the dust while people laugh. Elias hadn't rescued her. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own mind. He had offered something real. Work, partnership, ground to stand on. And she had evaluated it and accepted it on terms she'd stated plainly in front of witnesses. That wasn't rescue. That was two people recognizing something useful and true about each other and deciding to act on it. The rest of it, Crawford, the documents, the letters, the proceeding in Helena, none of that had come from extraordinary courage. It had come from paying attention, from keeping records, from understanding that power works by making you feel alone, and that the answer to that is to find the people who are experiencing the same thing and stand together until you are visible. She was not a hero. She had been scared most of the time. She had been wrong about some things. She had lost sleep and made calculation errors, and written one letter she later thought was too aggressive and one she thought wasn't aggressive enough. She had built something anyway. That, she thought, was what anyone could do. Not the building of something perfect. There was no such thing. Just the building. Just the daily decision to keep laying ground instead of waiting for someone else to lay it for you. The school ran for 3 years with Eleanor Voss before Eleanor married and moved north, and they found a second teacher, a man named Caleb Johansson, who had the patience of someone who genuinely liked children and the practical knowledge that mountain children needed alongside their reading. The Hendersons' daughter was one of the first students. The Morrison boys, both of them. Eventually, children from 4 other families whose parents had been quietly circling the edges of the valley's trouble without ever becoming visible, until the visibility of what Clara and Elias had done made staying invisible feel less necessary. James Alderman stopped by the ranch one afternoon in the second year, ostensibly to return a borrowed tool, actually because Alderman had never quite lost the sheriff's habit of checking on things. He stood in the yard with his coffee. Clara had poured it before he asked, because she always poured coffee before people asked. It was one of the things about her that Elias had stopped trying to get ahead of. and looked at the school building and the fence line and the general evidence of a place that was being lived in fully rather than just occupied. "People talk about you differently now," he said, "in town." "I know," she said. "Some of them feel bad about the day you arrived." "Some of them should," she said, not bitterly, just accurately. He nodded, accepting that. "Ruth says you're the best thing that happened to this valley in 20 years. "Ruth is generous." "Ruth is accurate," Alderman said. "There's a difference." She looked at him. He was looking back at her with the direct, assessing gaze she'd learned to trust. The gaze of a man who said what he meant and meant what he said and had no investment in comfortable fictions. "Thank you," she said, "for everything you did. From the beginning." "You built it," he said. "I just held some of the pieces." He finished his coffee and rode back to town. She stood in the yard for a few minutes after he left. The mountain was the mountain. The school building sat solid on its timber frame. From inside, she could hear Caleb Johansson's voice and the sound of children working through something difficult. Elias came up behind her the way he always did, quietly, and stood beside her. "Alderman gone?" he said. "Just now?" He looked at the school. She looked at the school. "Good building," he said. "You did most of the work," she said. "You told me how to do the east corner correctly. You would have figured it out." "Slower," he said. "And worse." She laughed. The real kind, not the performed kind she'd relied on for years when laughing seemed like the expected response to something, the kind that came from actually finding something funny. He put his arm around her shoulders, brief and easy, the way people do who have gotten comfortable enough with each other that contact doesn't require occasion. She leaned into it for a moment. Then she straightened up. "The waterline on the north slope," she said. "I know," he said. "It's not going to fix itself." "It never does," he said. They went to fix it together, which was, in the end, the whole story. Not the dramatic parts. Those had mattered, but they were not the whole story. The whole story was this. Two people who had both learned to do everything alone, discovering, one ordinary day at a time, that doing it together was better. Not easier. Not perfect. Just better. And that was more than enough.